If everyone could take a seat, we'll get started momentarily. Everyone, please find a seat and we'll get started.
Good morning. Oh, that's nice. Let's try that again. Good morning. I love that. Happy Wednesday. I'm not a morning person, so I have no idea why I'm so cheery. But I think I'm cheery because I'm happy to be here with all of you. For those of you who don't know, my name is Morgan Ortagus. I am the State Department spokesperson. You can catch my briefings live on state.gov. Thank you, of course, for joining us today for the second ministerial to advance religious freedom. I am so happy to be here today. I'm so proud. And I just want to start off by thanking Ambassador Brownback and his entire team. This is one of the most impressive things that you will see anywhere in the world. And you guys deserve a round of applause. Let's give them one. So we are all here, of course, because we have a shared belief in the importance of religious freedom as a fundamental human right. We believe all people should be able to practice their beliefs in peace. They should be able to choose their faith, change their faith, speak about their faith to others, and teach their faith to their children. All people should be free to build places of worship alone or in fellowship with others, or choose to practice no religion at all. What's more, we believe protecting this human right is conducive to countries' stability and to their prosperity. No nation can fulfill its potential if its people cannot exercise their innermost beliefs. The theme of this track of the ministerial is emerging trends in religious freedom. Religious freedom is not an isolated issue. It is deeply intertwined with other human rights and the political, economic, and social issues that affect all of us. The speakers you will hear from today will explore the relationships between religious freedom and topics such as countering violent extremism, atrocity prevention, and women's rights, my favorite issue. One of the most critical issues facing us today is how global trends in technology and communications can affect religious freedom. Advances in these areas can bring religious communities together, but they can also provide tools for authoritarian regimes and violent extremists to restrict religious freedom and repress minorities. I, of course, am deeply honored to introduce the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, Ajit Pai. Chairman Pai grew up in Kansas and, fun fact, used to work with one of the State Department's own Kansans, Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback. Ajit Pai is the 34th chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. He was designated chairman by President Donald J. Trump in January 2017. He previously served as commissioner at the FCC, appointed by then-President Barack Obama, and confirmed unanimously by the United States Senate in 2012. Chairman Pai has spent more than 2 decades in public service. You don't look old enough for that. Spanning all branches of the federal government. In addition to serving at the FCC, he has worked at the Department of Justice, the U.S. Senate, and clerked in the U.S. District Court. At the FCC, Chairman Pai's top priority is bridging the digital divide and providing digital opportunity for all Americans. Chairman Pai graduated with honors from Harvard University and from the University of Chicago Law School, where he was the editor of the University of Chicago Law Review and won the Thomas R. Morrow Prize. Ambitious. Chairman Pai is the son of immigrants from India and grew up in Parsons, Kansas, as we said earlier. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming one of the most impressive people we have in government today, Chairman Ajit Pai.
Well, good morning, and thank you so much, Ms. Ortagus, for that too kind introduction. It is wonderful to see all of you here, and it is truly humbling to be a part of an event with so many who have sacrificed for the cause of religious freedom. It might not seem obvious why the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, the leader of America's expert agency on communications technologies, would be speaking at a forum on religious freedom. But I believe that any informed discussion about promoting liberty religious liberty around the world has to include a discussion about changes in how we communicate with each other, changes that are being driven, after all, by new technologies. Most people accept the idea that the internet is transforming virtually every aspect of modern life, how we live, how we work, and how we raise our families. And it might feel odd at first to think of religion in this context, but to me, it makes sense. We use digital tools to connect with each other. We use digital tools to take in new ideas. We use digital tools to express our values and our beliefs. And so naturally, the internet revolution will impact the way we practice our faiths. And that impact has been positive and, well, not so positive. On the positive side, these new communications technologies have enabled countless possibilities for people of faith. They create ways to study your religion in your way and on your time. For example, YouVersion's Bible app has been downloaded onto more than 380 million phones in every country on the earth. Last year, users of the app read 27 billion chapters and shared 409 million Bible verses with other members of the community. I'm just speculating, but perhaps one of the verses shared was from the book of Matthew, chapter 9, verse 17, which could be read to embrace technological innovation. And it says, as you probably know, neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. And to be clear, YouVersion's Bible app is just one of the many apps that are out there. Now, digitization has given new life to some of the world's most ancient religious texts. For instance, Father Columbus Stewart at St. John's College in rural Minnesota has waged a global campaign to digitize sacred manuscripts for minority religious communities from Egypt to Ethiopia to India. Preserving these words digitally preserves these worlds forever. And that is especially important as civilization's patrimony hangs by a thread in many parts of the world. Consider that several years ago in Mali, the famed city of Timbuktu came under the control for almost a year by Tuareg rebels and then an al-Qaeda affiliate known as Ansar Dine. Tens of thousands of ancient texts, including very old copies of the Quran, were saved only because a 50-year-old librarian risked his life to distribute these texts to families who agreed to hide them. Well, technology can help us in cases when we're not so lucky as to have people like that. Now, digital technologies also create new avenues for faith communities to live the Word of God and to serve others. Last year, the Vatican hosted its first hackathon. Yes, I've used the words Vatican and hackathon in the same sentence, attracting 120 Catholic, Muslim, Jewish, and evangelical Christian coders from more than 30 countries. And among the many inventions developed over 36 hours, students built a social network that empowers churches to tap into the volunteer networks of other organizations, as well as a web-based app that pairs employers with homeless job seekers. And perhaps most important, the internet creates unprecedented opportunities for people of faith to connect with other believers. And this is incredibly critical to religious minorities. If you are one of the few people in your community of your faith, you can feel quite alone and isolated. But the internet can reduce that feeling of isolation. If you have a broadband connection, you can feel a sense of community with others. You can participate in online services, in study groups, in prayer circles, or in other ministries, even if the nearest church or temple or mosque or synagogue is hundreds of miles away. And I can only imagine how empowering this must be for religious minorities who live in countries where people don't enjoy the same freedoms that we do here in the United States. But, as with so many other things, with the good comes the bad. And for all of the promise of digital technologies to promote religious freedom, there are also very real downsides. Just look across the globe at some of the most well-known cases of religious persecution, and you can see technology increasingly being used as a tool of oppression. The suffering of Rohingya Muslims in Burma goes back years. an estimated 700,000 refugees have been forced to leave the country for Bangladesh. And now, state forces are aggressively using online tools to harass this population. Facebook, for instance, launched in Burma in 2011, and it became enormously popular. As one journalist put it, quote, "The arrival of Facebook provided a country with severely limited digital literacy, a hyper-connected version of the country's ubiquitous tea shops where people gathered to swap stories, news, and gossip." But unfortunately, government officials and militants have aggressively used this digital platform to incite a culture of hatred against the Rohingya. They used Facebook to spread false rumors of attacks. The government's information committee identified more than 1,300 Muslims as terrorists on its official Facebook page, posting names and photos without any due process. And according to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom's annual report, the rapid rise of false information through social media in Burma may be a precursor to genocide. And not only did Facebook fail to curtail this harassment, in a cruel twist, it actually took down posts documenting violence against Rohingya and suspended a group that was telling them where attacks were taking place so those attacks could be avoided. But when it comes to harnessing digital tools to punish religious minorities, the biggest offender is the world's most populous country, China. To make sure that people aren't sharing religious messages online or any other messages that the government finds objectionable, China has built an army 2 million strong to police the internet. Now, for context, the actual US Army has 500,000 active duty personnel, and we have about 1.3 million active personnel across our armed services. So China employs a significantly larger group of people to violate the rights of their citizens than the United States employs to militarily defend rights like free expression and freedom of assembly. Now, last year, the Chinese government's Office of Religious Affairs proposed new rules to ban religious services, prayer, or preaching online. These restrictions would deny people the ability to practice their faith and would also make open discussions of faith with others much more difficult. Arguably, the most distressing stories coming out of China lately are the government's efforts to crack down on Uyghur Muslims. Already, as many as 2 million Uyghurs have been sent to re-education camps in the western province of Xinjiang. 2 million people. And now the Chinese are building an unprecedented surveillance state in Xinjiang. Disfavored communities are subject to near constant monitoring and data collection tools using technologies like facial recognition under the threat of being sent to these camps. And meanwhile, the Han Chinese in the region are generally left alone. As one China researcher for Human Rights Watch put it, quote, "These systems are designed for a very explicit purpose, to target Muslims." What is particularly troubling is that the Chinese government is looking to export its repressive digital policies and practices. Chinese officials have hosted trainings and seminars on what they call cyberspace management, which have been attended by representatives of at least 36 countries. And in the past year, according to Freedom House, countries have passed restrictive cybercrime and media laws after engaging with Chinese officials. Now, of course, it is not just governments that are using technology as tools of religious oppression. In 2018, the State Department designated 8 non-state actors as entities of particular concern for severe religious freedom violations. Unsurprisingly, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria was at the top of the list. Among its many atrocities, ISIS aggressively targeted religious minorities. They specifically targeted members of the Yazidi faith, taking thousands captive and treating the women as sex slaves. And ISIS's persecution of Christians has been designated by the European Union as genocide. The authors of a book on the weaponization of social media have written that the self-styled Islamic State owes its existence to social media. Its online recruitment strategy is so extensive that it distributes content in a long list of languages, even sign language. They also use social media to project strength greater than their actual numbers and to terrorize the public. Think about this. They announced their 2014 invasion of northern Iraq with a Twitter campaign that used the hashtag #AllEyesOnISIS. So, when it comes to religious freedom, the digital revolution is a two-sided coin. On one hand, technology can be harnessed for tremendous good. It can make it easier for people of faith to practice their religion, to connect with fellow believers, to organize a religious community, and to learn more about the teachings of their faith. But that same technology can be used as an influence for repression. It can be used to incite hatred against religious minorities, and it can be used to facilitate their persecution. So what approach should governments take to the intersection of the digital revolution and religion? Well, speaking for myself, I believe that our top priority must be to safeguard the freedom of expression. After all, the freedom of speech and the free exercise of religion are practically intertwined. One supports the other. And when government has the power to restrict free expression, religious minorities too often pay the price. Second, it is vital for countries that believe in religious freedom to join together on the international stage, to fight for an internet where the freedom of conscience is respected. And this also means joining together to speak out against those governments that are using the internet to repress their populations and seek to export that repression to other nations. And we certainly must not allow countries to hijack international organizations to legitimize or aid those efforts. And third, we need to recognize that these problems cannot be solved just by changing an algorithm or by passing a law. Instead, people with open minds and open hearts from all faiths need to come together to promote positive narratives to counter extremism and hatred. After all, we are all in this together, and countries are stronger when they support the freedoms of everybody to worship and believe and to speak as one might choose. And perhaps the best example of this came courtesy of America's first president, George Washington. In August of 1790, he wrote a now famous letter to the Hebrew congregations of Rhode Island. And in that letter, he promised the Jewish community in Newport that this newly created country, the United States of America, would give them a safe home. And as he put it, borrowing from the Old Testament, may the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. And tellingly, just 1 year later, the United States would ratify the First Amendment, putting into our Constitution the core protections of religious freedom. Well, today our world is quite different, partly because it is quite digital. But to me, Washington's beautiful sentiment still resonates. It still calls us to the path of tolerance and freedom, aided by technologies that connect and inform and inspire and protect. And so, as I close, I will borrow from President Washington once again. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness upon our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy. Let us all go forth to do our part to spread the good word and to be useful here in our several vocations, and to enable all peoples around the world to practice their faith freely and to be everlastingly happy. I think this gathering here is a good start. Thank you once again for your attention and for the invitation.
Well, thank you, Chairman Pai, for those remarkable remarks. That was a great way to start our day. We're so grateful for your service and your contributions to the discussions and to kick off this track 2 on day 2 of the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom. My name is Knox Thames, and I serve as the Special Advisor for Religious Minorities here at the State Department. And I want to echo the speakers before to thank you for coming, for participating, and being here to join your voice and to give your time and energy to the cause of religious freedom for all. It's now my great privilege to introduce and welcome to the stage Ambassador Callista Gingrich, our ambassador to the Holy See in Rome. She's been a staunch advocate for religious freedom, and we're very fortunate to have her with us today.
Good morning. On behalf of Secretary Pompeo, I'm delighted to welcome you to the Department of State for the second day of the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom. It's an honor to address this distinguished gathering of civil society leaders and champions of religious liberty. As the U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, I work closely with the Vatican to advance and defend religious freedom. I'm pleased to announce that on October 2nd, as a direct result of this ministerial, the United States and the Holy See will co-host a symposium in Rome highlighting the importance of working with faith-based organizations to support and protect religious freedom. A crucial part of this week's ministerial is the opportunity to hear directly from victims and survivors of religious persecution. If there is one fundamental goal of this ministerial, it is to rid the world of religious persecution and repression. The United States is deeply committed to this endeavor and will never settle for people of faith to be persecuted, repressed, or merely tolerated by governments or societies. Religious freedom is a key building block of peace and security. It provides a foundation on which a society can thrive. It is in the interest of every nation to uphold and defend religious freedom. Tomorrow, Secretary Pompeo will emphasize this point as he addresses foreign leaders on concrete actions to protect religious minorities and to defend religious freedom. As we have seen throughout history, countries that respect religious freedom are safer, more prosperous, and secure. One country that does not respect religious freedom is the People's Republic of China. The Chinese government has institutionalized a campaign of persecution, harassment, and imprisonment of religious minorities, including Muslims, Christians, and Buddhists. As Ambassador Brownback said, the Chinese government is at war with faith, and it is a war they will not win. Since 1999, the United States has designated China as a country of particular concern under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. This is the most concerning category reserved for governments engaged in severe violations of religious freedom. And although China has emerged on the international stage, the appalling state of religious freedom on the mainland is only getting worse. In the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, Chinese authorities have detained more than 1 million ethnic Muslims. Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and members of other Muslim minority groups have been targeted and forcibly relocated to internment camps. The Chinese government continues to repress Christians. Last year, mainland China began enforcing new religious regulations to control where people worship and with whom. There are reports in Henan province that authorities have prohibited all minors from entering Catholic churches to celebrate Mass. Chinese officials are closing churches, confiscating Bibles, and persecuting their own citizens for simply practicing their faith. And in Tibet, China continues its decades-long policies of aggressively interfering with Tibetan Buddhist practices and Tibetan culture. Domestic and overseas restrictions on both lay people and Tibetan Buddhist monastics hinder traditional religious pilgrimages. Chinese authorities have banned Tibetan children from participating in religious activities. They forced thousands of monks and nuns out of their homes and destroyed their monasteries. Indeed, speculation exists that the Communist Party in China will attempt to appoint the next Dalai Lama. The international community must unequivocally insist that members of the Tibetan community, like members of all faith communities, should be able to select and revere their religious leaders without government interference. In a few moments, we'll hear from an incredible young woman, Nyima Lhamo. Nyima Lhamo is a human rights advocate and the niece of the late Tenzin Delek Rinpoche, a highly revered reincarnate Lama and one of the most prominent Tibetan political prisoners who died in a Chinese prison in July of 2015. Recognized by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, as a reincarnated Lama in the 1980s, the Rinpoche was a community leader and a staunch advocate for the protection and preservation of Tibetan culture and religion for decades. In 2002, the Rinpoche was arrested on false charges of exploding bombs and distributing dissident propaganda. His trial was held in secret, and even though he had no independent legal counsel and no real evidence against him, he received a death sentence. The sentence was later commuted to life in prison, where he remained until his death. As a result of Nyima Lhamo publicly questioning the cause of her uncle's death and demanding an investigation, she too was detained by Chinese authorities, along with her mother. Nyima Lhamo subsequently fled Tibet, leaving behind her mother and her 6-year-old daughter. Despite the risks, Nyima Lhamo continues to speak out about her uncle's death, appealing to the international community to prevail upon the Chinese government to carry out a thorough investigation. Her family continues to face harassment. Chinese authorities have threatened to persecute her family if she continues to advocate for transparency, accountability, and her God-given right to worship freely. She's here today, despite this threat. The Chinese Communist Party has clearly underestimated this courageous young woman. Please join me in welcoming Nyima Lhamo.
Good morning. Tari sunduki chabudi thole pemiche de round the misege dikdins dele rumich kolhi jiwa ngala kokanawala samalola tuji cheshui. At onset, I would like to thank Ambassador Gingrich for this introduction, and I would like to thank everybody, the State Department and the organizers for inviting me here to speak at this important conference about Tibetan religious freedom. Dikdins dele rumbuchina pu shashulu yubi jangu rumbuchi nganzizo lamachri da koina jangu rumbuchi kasuji ruda pu gi chue the region la chale mobana As you heard just now, Tuku Tenzin Delek Rinpoche is somebody who was recognized by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He is from Eastern Tibet, and in addition to his religious task, he also was very much active in social work in the community. Today, in the Jana Juntela Gomari, Mani Kauzur, Nitu Nilola, Rumbichinda, Kungichale, Lozaterunica, and Juzutire. It's because of this that the Chinese government was fearful of him, and therefore they detained Rinpoche and his assistant Lobsang Tundo. Nani Jirayumar Rinpoche, Nitu Salone, Tsetsungo, Sota de Jiri, Nitungalone, Tsetsola Jibri. And as mentioned earlier, subsequently they were first sentenced to death, and then that was. For Rinpoche, it was commuted to a life sentence in 2005.
nitu golone da ni chi yezge de sai da na jana jung go che kai ser sala pi ne da rumbu ching che de na ni re mani khayu zer de che de chen kan goma la shi gula na jawa khur zna jana jung ti chama yami ta re.
However, because the Tibetan people greatly valued Rinpoche's services, in 2009, over 40,000 of them sent a petition to the Chinese government saying that they disagreed with the Chinese government's sentencing of Tenzin Delek Rinpoche, and they wanted the Chinese government to give him a fair trial and do a retrial.
Ta rumbuchi chen kan no la ganyo lo josan tsele wu yure tendre indi jeyu ki rumbuchi ki mise inare getu inare Naomi inare tsama ge jana jula rawa jada jumba je yurde na rawa chi ga druma tse mise mo dunji rawre tsokon chu kangi jada jumba chi yure.
Not only that, his disciples and we, his relatives, also appealed several times for the Chinese government to provide us what was legally permissible under Chinese laws to have access to Rinpoche and to give him a fair trial. The Chinese government did not pay heed to any of our petitions.
Rinpoche lo nga la tsokon jine zuni gasu chami ro na namu da tsama ge khamo ko ne lengu mobuchi pe na gemuchi ka chi ting jana ge Beijing ge de chindu go ka la ngo ge je ne dashi ji ne de chenko go ka la Rinpoche thama de tu ju re Rinpoche ganyu lo josa ne thama tu bis tu ya rayu man.
For the first several years of his detention, we even didn't know where he was. Eventually, we learned about his imprisonment near Chengdu in Sichuan province. And then his disciples and many of the Tibetan people went there to demonstrate in support of Rinpoche. And during his 13 years of imprisonment, his family members and relatives only got opportunity for 6 times to see him.
Nidu jiang lo thama de Rinpoche ko no la today indi namu de me nye de tsama ge Rinpoche jana jung wazla ngonje che de yore.
Unfortunately, in 2015, Rinpoche died in prison. We, his family members, believe that that was a suspicious death, and we believe the Chinese authorities killed Rinpoche.
Then indi da Rinpoche thama ge bug che de region le tene thama ge chumbu mela jia ge ko namu de la te yomare thama Rinpoche ge kuduma che kethe da namu choma le te yomare.
The inhumanity of the Chinese government can be seen by the fact that even we, his relatives, were not given the opportunity to do the final rites for him according to Tibetan Buddhist tradition, nor where we made given access to his body in the last rite.
Then that's how much like a chance that Rinpoche ge ne dang le dan ne pe no le che de rang wa kan de yume sama del dan ha ko re.
So from Tenzin Delek Rinpoche's situation, we can clearly see what is the situation of religious freedom in Tibet.
Da pe zona pe che Rinpoche ina re ko ina jang Rinpoche ngonzi on ji tu gu ji ko nga lo la ngonzi ge zone ti zone je ji me ba tan cha re.
As was mentioned earlier, the Chinese authorities interfere actively in Tibetan Buddhist tradition, including in the issue of recognition of reincarnations. For example, in the case of the Panchen Lama, who was recognized by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the Chinese authorities detained him, and we don't know where he is right now.
Rinpoche ge thama de la aman je di ko skar so de la no nga jana ju ge pe ma so nye to pa te so don do chike to chro lo lama yi lo man chita ten ju lo man chita ten ju na ta ten ko la na ta don de ko ina ter ka la dragon ro mi hor ka ina tu na ya dragon man ta ri ko la na ni to sta ku tin de sang ge yo ma ta ri ko la na ni to sta ko jang ko ro bi chi ka su chi du da ko pe la ga da la ta na ni to dan da yi de ki che to hor ka cha ka ko ma se la kha sa ye na khulan ro bi chi ki ta ka na yo dan da yi de nga ni tu chi du lo la nga shulo strong we.
During one of the few meetings that was permitted to my family, my mother, when she met Rinpoche, he told her about the trauma that he went through under Chinese hand and how, despite there being no basis for his detention or for his persecution, he suffered greatly. And he said that he would do everything possible within his command to take his issue up in the Chinese judiciary system, and he asked us also to do whatever we can to tell the truth about his situation to the world. And therefore, in 2016, I fled Tibet and so that I can make the world aware of Rinpoche's case. As I was listening to the proceedings yesterday and today, I began to feel that what if Rinpoche was alive today and he knew about such a conference being held here? What would it mean to him? And I'm greatly moved by this feeling that I had. At this conference, which the United States State Department is organizing, and we have participation from many countries, I wanted to take this opportunity to make some appeals, particularly based on Rinpoche's work that you have in his book here, which we have compiled, and I would like to appeal to you on some matters. First, during my 2 days of participation over here, when I looked at the participants, I had seen that we are of different colors, we have of different ethnicity, we have from different religious traditions, but we are all bound together by this solidarity about religious freedom. And therefore, I firmly believe that if we can continue with this solidarity and continue with this push for religious freedom together, we can make this world a better place. And my first appeal about Tenzin Delek Rinpoche is the case that, as we have informed you now, his death was mysterious, suspicious. The Chinese government hasn't accounted for his death, nor have they done an investigation. Therefore, they even did not give us a death certificate about Tenzin Delek Rinpoche. So we would like the international community to urge the Chinese government to account for Tenzin Delek Rinpoche's death. The Chinese, second point, the Chinese government claimed that they provide religious freedom in Tibet. If that is so, then I want the Chinese government to allow the international community to have access to Tibet, whether it's journalists, diplomats, or ordinary citizens who should have every access to go to Tibet and see the situation of the religious freedom for themselves. Religious freedom doesn't merely mean ritualistic aspects like prostrations or going around monasteries or seeing some monks and nuns out there. Religious freedom for the Tibetan Buddhism means having the opportunity for the teachers to teach and for the disciples to listen, and for this interaction of teacher and disciple to be there throughout. Unfortunately, the Chinese government doesn't allow that. Thirdly, the issue of reincarnation system in Tibetan Buddhism is very integral to the Tibetan Buddhist practice, and it's only His Holiness the Dalai Lama who has the authority and the right to recognize reincarnations, including the next reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. I believe and I know for certain that more than 90% of the Tibetans will follow whatever the Dalai Lama says, and not the Chinese government.
Bur Nongi, Chosin, but Pem Mombo, your Tindi, Zerpi, Jana Jungi, Ludo Tangur, Digica New Redic had the songi, Jana Jula.
And the fifth point is that the Panchen Lama and several Tibetan political prisoners continue to be under detention in imprisonment in China today. And we would like the international community to urge for their release. And I want to say here that if anything happens to the Panchen Lama or to the political prisoners in Tibet today, the Chinese government should be solely held responsible. And there, I would like to end with these recommendations. I hope that you would continue to help support the Tibetan people. And also, I have this great responsibility that there are many people in Tibet who have the wish and the desire to go out to the world and talk about their situation. Unfortunately, they cannot do that. I have this advantage of being here, and so I look upon myself as a representative of the Tibetan people to be conveying their message to you. Finally, for a broader political solution to the issue of Tibet, religious freedom is a part of the human rights human right, also the political freedom for the Tibetan people. Therefore, I would urge the international community to help His Holiness the Dalai Lama in his effort to find a solution to the Tibetan issue. I would have many things to say about Rinpoche's situation and the case, but unfortunately we don't have much time. And so I have summarized whatever I wanted to say here today. And thank you once again for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for your courage and the power of your convictions. We're with you, and we want to do what we can to help. I now want to transition to our first plenary session discussion panel. We're very pleased to have a tireless, fearless advocate chair it, Ambassador Kelley Currie. So I would invite Ambassador Currie and the other panelists to make their way to the panel here, and they'll be having a discussion with all of us about documenting atrocities.
Thank you, Knox, for that very kind introduction. And I want to also recognize our previous speakers this morning who have, I think, set a really wonderful tone for today's proceedings. And thank you all, of course, for joining us this morning to talk about accountability in the form of documenting atrocities. I'm so honored to be here today to moderate this discussion with three incredibly distinguished panelists who I know quite well and have worked with, and am honored to be sharing a stage with, because these are folks who really they know what they work on the ground, they know what it's like, and they're involved in the day-to-day work of documenting atrocities. And they also do it in the context of protecting religious freedom in a way that's really important for all of us. These panelists have all thought about and worked on intensely this issue of documenting atrocities, and so they are very familiar with both the promises and the challenges that documentation and accountability efforts present. They each will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then I'll use my prerogative as the chair to kick us off with a few questions. And then if we do have time, I'll give the floor to those who might have some questions themselves from the audience. But as I said, the topic of this panel today is one that's really close to my heart, because here at the State Department, I run a small but very mighty and enthusiastic office that is called the Office of Global Criminal Justice. And we formerly were known as the War Crimes Office, and people still think of us as the War Crimes Office in a lot of ways, because most of our work is focused on documenting and bringing accountability for the most heinous crimes: war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, genocide, and other mass atrocities. And we work with a variety of partners, like my fellow panelists here today, to advance U.S. policies that help hold perpetrators of atrocities accountable and support broader transitional justice efforts. Accountability is important for so many reasons. It demonstrates to victims and survivors that the international community not only took notice of their suffering, but is also taking action to seek justice. Alongside other transitional justice measures, it may help them to begin rebuilding their communities and move on. At the State Department, we have a long and proud history of working with members of ethnic and religious groups who've been attacked and whose human rights have been violated in the most horrific ways, in part because of their religion, including groups such as the Yazidi and other minorities in the Middle East. In 2017, the State Department determined that ISIS was responsible for genocide against the Yazidi, Christian, and Shia Muslims in areas it controlled, and for crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing against these same groups, and in some cases against Sunni Muslims, Kurds, and other minorities. Members of religious and ethnic minority groups, including Yazidis and Christians, inform us that this determination was very meaningful for them. Promoting accountability for those responsible for such mass atrocities and addressing survivors' need for justice shows communities that these heinous acts will not be tolerated. It shows perpetrators that committing crimes against those whom they perceive as weak in their society, including members of religious minority groups, does not exempt them from the consequences. It contributes to preventing future atrocities, including by driving changes in domestic, legal, regulatory, and cultural institutions. But too often, accountability in the immediate term is frustratingly out of reach for these communities. Nonetheless, survivors and families of victims and those in the international community who stand with them are preparing for and hastening the day when accountability is possible by gathering and preserving a broad range of information and evidence on ongoing and past atrocities, by analyzing the command structures of state and non-state organizations that perpetrate these atrocities, and by identifying the material and intellectual authors of the crimes and searching for appropriate judicial forums. These documentation efforts, while essential to criminal accountability, also serve a much broader function to advance justice. Survivor testimony, physical evidence, and analysis of mass atrocities can be elements for other transitional justice measures, such as truth-telling mechanisms, institutional reforms, reparations, and memorialization. In my own work, prior to coming to the State Department, I was privileged to work with wonderful civil society activists in Burma who were taking bold initiatives on transitional justice at a time that many donors were afraid to even talk about this subject for fear that it would spook a transition process that was underway there. This idea that transitional justice is something that is imposed from outside or is tangential to broader reforms has been proven wrong so many times. But this myth persists because it's easier for both fragile new democracies and transitional countries and their survivors and their supporters in the international community to push these issues to the side than deal with them in the first instance. I'm proud to say that the State Department supports many transitional justice and documentation efforts around the world. Too many to go into detail here, but I will note a few. Last year, Congress appropriated $5 million to be administered by my office to support grants to advance accountability in Iraq and Syria for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, including through collection of evidence. I think we have some competitors for that grant sitting at the table this morning. In addition, DRL, our fellow bureau here at the State Department, has a long-standing history of supporting locally led documentation efforts in countries including the Central African Republic, Guatemala, Iraq, South Sudan, Sri Lanka, Syria, and most recently with respect to Rohingya communities who fled Burma to Bangladesh. At the international level, the United States has supported the creation of independent mechanisms to investigate and document atrocities, such as UNITAD, headed by Karim Khan. And the UN Security Council created UNITAD to collect, store, and preserve evidence of ISIS atrocities. The $2 million contribution from the United States to UNITAD this year, as well as the years the department supported work with the Iraqi authorities to develop their domestic capacity to process mass graves through the International Commission for Missing Persons, have helped UNITAD to hit the ground running and begin exhuming mass graves in the Yazidi Sinjar region of Iraq. We've also supported politically and financially similar investigative mechanisms in the UN, including in Burma and Syria. And many other documentation and transitional justice efforts outside UN auspices are being pursued wherever in the world human rights activists are armed with a smartphone camera, a broadband connection, or the traditional analog methods of human rights fact-finding, research, and reporting. It's in this context of burgeoning documentation initiatives that I'm privileged to be able to moderate this panel today with some of the world's foremost experts and practitioners. For the sake of time, I won't go over their full bios, but I will provide a brief overview. We'll start with Karim. Karim is the special advisor and head of UNITAD, established by the Security Council to promote accountability efforts for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes committed by ISIS. He has decades of experience in international criminal law, including at many international criminal tribunals, and deep experience working with and representing victims of human rights violations. Thank you, Karim. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, Ambassador Currie, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and also on a personal and professional level for the immense and constant support you personally have provided to me, to UNITAD, as well as the support, of course, from the United States government. I'm proud to consider the United States a strong supporter of the United Nations investigative team to promote accountability. In my view, ladies and gentlemen, this is really one of the most important events that one can attend. I'm not an activist. I don't have that right being a United Nations official. We are non-political. But we are focused on very focused forensic investigations. And one reason, amongst many others, why this conference is so important is illustrated by my mandate. If one reduces the crimes of Daesh, the torture, the burning of people alive, the crucifixions, the throwing of people from buildings, the beheadings, the sexual slavery and the rapes, one can see that the seed of evil was religious intolerance. It was a lack of humanity, a lack of willingness to allow individuals freedom of belief, freedom of conscience. And that poison seed was the root of so many evils that we are currently investigating. Acts that constitute or may constitute international crimes of the most severest order: genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And I think it's worth remembering that this issue of freedom of religion is not simply a normative issue of human rights. It's not some soft law, important though that is, enshrined though it is in beautiful constitutions of various countries of the world. It is something that is key to stability, to national security. Because what we have also seen is fanaticism and extremism, unfortunately, and it's an indictment on humanity, begets extremism and fanaticism. We see the Islamic State, but we also see the aspects of extremism in Myanmar, so-called Buddhist fundamentalism. We see Hindu fundamentalism in some parts of India. So the warning signs are out there that this is not simply a human rights issue, critical though that is, and protected though that must be. UNITAD, from the beginning of my appointment, I was at some pains to emphasize to the myriad victims that there's no hierarchy. There's simply no hierarchy of victims. We have representatives that have been here from the Yazidi community, from the Christian community. They've suffered enormously. But we also have Shias, temples and mosques and shrines that were destroyed. The Imam of, the Sunni Imam of Mosul was executed because he refused to bow his head to this false caliphate of Baghdadi. We have the Shabak, we have the Turkmen Shia. The simple reality is that any individual that had the audacity in that environment to say, I have a choice to make about how I worship and what I believe, was clearly in the crosshairs of this most un-Islamic of states. So in reaching out to the communities, we've said that it's not as some kind of favor to the victim communities that the United Nations is there in the field. It is seeking to discharge a right that these victims have to proper investigations so that those that have committed those acts may be properly adjudicated, that their acts may be properly adjudicated in a court of law. And it's important to emphasize that the goal of UNITAD is not simply to become a glorified library, important though those are. As a lawyer, we love libraries. But it's not enough to simply gather evidence so that it gathers cobwebs. It needs to feed into independent and impartial trials so that there may be adjudications that stand the test of time. This is why I've repeatedly said that both Iraq and humanity requires its Nuremberg moment. Not as some kind of gold star of human rights compliance, not merely for that. But what did Nuremberg do? It did many things. In fact, sometimes we take it for granted what a pivotal moment that was, and also the role of the United States in insisting that there be some judicial accountability for people that Churchill and others thought are so patently obvious we can simply do away with them. It was to separate the poison of fascism from the German people. That's worth pausing about, because we see Germany today as such a vibrant democracy. It has progressed economically in the arts, in the cultures, significantly since those dark days of the Third Reich and the pogroms against the Jews and any individual that didn't subscribe to their evil ideology. But in addition to that, it can prevent revisionism. It can put forward a record that can educate. So in relation to Daesh, it's also important for Iraq, given the rich diversity that was Iraq and that it is Iraq and that needs to be nurtured and protected as some kind of, not only a cradle of civilization, as Iraq are always keen to emphasize, but as some wealth of all humanity, the diversity from the Yazidi communities, the Christian communities, the Shia and the Sunnis, the diversity of the temples and the mosques and the churches are part of the legacy of humanity. And if we don't separate the poison of Daesh from the Sunni community, there cannot be peace in Iraq, given that so many millions of people are Sunni. And it's not only Iraq. Step back and see Kuwait and Saudi and Jordan. If this animus keeps intensifying, if it is not separated by some forum, and the rule of law is a powerful sword to separate those that are responsible from those that are innocent or those that are not guilty, this cycle of violence, unfortunately, will continue. So in relation to the first topic of this discussion, the lessons of the past, I think it's staring us all in the face. This is not only about normative human rights, it's about something fundamental to humanity. What have we done? Well, apart from the words, we've made efforts to go to all the different places where individual groups have been targeted. Just 2 or 3 weeks ago, I went to the Bartola church up close to Mosul, and in Bartella I saw the Saint Chamonix church. I went to another church of the Virgin Mary, and I saw there absolutely desecrated. The flag of ISIL was painted in the church. The crypt was burnt. The altar had been desecrated. They had some school boards and whiteboards were still there writing in these churches. And then I went to the graves outside, and some of the graves had been actually, they were looking for treasure or something, but they had been vandalized. And this is the kind of evil that we're looking at. And at the same midst of that house of worship that had been desecrated, I met 3 Christian women and 1 young boy and heard their accounts of honest, remarkable courage. It chills the blood to think what they went through and how many times in their story they were close to death. And there are many miracles like this that unite humanity. But the other important aspect of fair trials and accountability is that it is a forum to showcase the unity of humanity. We have examples even from Nadia Murad of being saved by a Sunni. We have examples of Christians saving people of other faiths, of Shia saving Christians. So in a court, you can help build social cohesion as well as an important record. It was during the time of Henry VIII, in fact, that Pope Leo X conferred the title of Defender of the Faith. And I think what this job has made even clearer to me, and it's actually something that even Prince Charles in England has emphasized, is that being a defender of faith, of all faith, is such an important banner to fly. It's not a banner that should only be formed by presidents or secretaries of state. It's a banner that each of us in this room, and I know many champions in this room, have to fly as part of the common heritage of humanity. Because only if we are our brother's keeper, only if we care as much for people that are of a different color or of a different religion or of a different creed because of their humanity, will we prevent these type of hemorrhages into the fabric, into the soul of humanity that we have witnessed far too often. We have heard time and time again the false promise of never again, since the awful Holocaust of the Jews under Nazi Germany. And yet we see time and time again. Only by realizing that the purpose of today is not esoteric but tangible will we have a chance. In terms of what states can do, I think this speaks very eloquently. The fact that the United States has put its resources into this event, and there's a growing momentum. Yesterday in London at the Foreign Office, there was a high-level conference, and a paper was passed from the United Kingdom seeking to prevent persecution of Christians. So the religion, the label, the creed should be irrelevant. The protection of faith should be important. Criminal investigations, creating a record that are incontrovertible, that punish those that are responsible, but also vindicate those that are not, that avoid collective punishment, are clearly and manifestly part of the solution to what is a growing problem that is going to continue, unfortunately, for a while yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Karim. Thank you for those incredibly thought-provoking and inspiring comments. And when the Secretary talks about effective multilateralism, this is what I think of. I think of UNITAD. I think of the ability that we have to accomplish really meaningful and important things through our contributions there. Our next speaker is Chris Engels, who is the Director of Investigations and Operations at the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, CIJA, a group that is very familiar to many of us here at the State Department. They're a non-governmental organization that has really set the standard for investigating atrocity crimes and terrorism and collecting evidence at a standard that can be used in criminal prosecutions. And one of the things that we talk about a lot in my office is there's a difference between information and evidence. And a lot of organizations that do advocacy work or work on human rights issues collect a lot of information. What CIJA does that's really remarkable is they collect evidence, and they make it at such a standard that we can, it can immediately be accessed by groups such as UNITAD and others that are, and state actors who want to prosecute evildoers. And this is a really important, they, like I said, set the gold standard and have really pioneered this kind of work at the non-governmental level. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Chris for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I have to say, first of all, a great thanks to Ambassador Brownback and his team, Knox and everyone else, for the great work in putting this together and bringing such a diverse audience together to share views, different opinions, different strategies on how we might further religious freedom. And it's a great opportunity to share with you what we at CIJA hope to contribute to this broad ecosystem of advocates here in these several days. Just a bit of a background on CIJA. We began this work as a non-governmental organization focusing specifically on the criminal justice space only about 8 years ago. And what we saw at that time was that there was a small gap in what was going on in the space of atrocity crime. And that was, it was often the case that in the midst of conflict, in the midst of mass atrocity, there was not the opportunity to collect evidence that might later be used at trial when those people responsible for those crimes might be apprehended, might find themselves in jurisdictions where they could be prosecuted. And what we had seen in our past experiences, most of us coming from the international criminal justice space, was that the inability to collect that evidence at the time meant that it was often lost. It meant that evidence that could have proved those who were most responsible for the crimes ended up being destroyed, being burned, disregarded, or indeed taken away when possible by those most responsible. And so we set up CIJA to try and mitigate that problem. What we also saw at the same time, and I think it's a great demonstration of the US efforts to alleviate that problem, is that there are two great silos in this space that we're talking about right now. One is the international criminal justice space, where you have actors such as us who are working on issues in countries that have experienced genocide and crimes against humanity and war crimes. And then you have very separately in another silo traditionally the international religious freedom movement, who is working to promote religious freedom and stop persecution. But of course, we both have the same goals, as Karim was talking about just a moment ago. And I think it's incredibly important that we try together as much as possible to coordinate these efforts. Just as you have here Ambassador Currie from Global Criminal Justice sitting and moderating this panel within this broader space discussing religious freedom. I think we all in the civil society space can do a better job of working together. And when we started this work, it was very much a theory, and we were told quite often by a number of people that non-governmental organizations didn't have any space in criminal justice and they should leave it to the professionals. It was all well-meaning, I'm sure. And I think the unfortunate reality is that it is often the case that in situations where the most egregious crimes are taking place against religious minorities, there is no authority to be there on the ground and document those crimes. And so when we're faced with a choice between no documentation, no collection of evidence, no preservation for later justice purposes, and the collection by civil society, then for us, it was an obvious choice that we will do what we can to preserve that evidence for future justice mechanisms. And that's what we've attempted to do. And luckily, I can say today that it's no longer a theory. We now work closely with a large number of domestic law enforcement and prosecutorial authorities in Europe and North America. We work with great organizations like Karim's and sharing evidence with them. We now have, in relation to crimes committed in Syria and Iraq alone, over 500 requests from domestic law enforcement a year to assist them in providing evidence that they could not collect but desperately want, because they want to play their part. They want to do their part in bringing those people to justice who are most responsible for crimes in Syria and Iraq. And so now we know that this is possible. We know that we can do this work, we can work together, and we can be a contributor to this international criminal justice space. And I think the bigger question is not what CJA can do now, but what we can do. And by we, I mean civil society. And I think it's a question that's worth all of us asking individually, because I think that we have different access, we have different roles to play, and we have different capabilities. And it is incredibly possible that each of us, while continuing our core mandate, whether that is human rights advocacy, whether it's spreading the word about atrocities being committed against religious minorities, whether it is promotion of education in places where freedom of speech is challenged, it is also possible, when one so desires, to work in the criminal justice space. And it's not a mystical art. It's very simple. There's simple things that one can do. And if one sees evidence of criminality and has documentation that these people are responsible for those crimes, with a little bit of thought, a little bit of forethought, and a little bit of planning, you can document who it was that was responsible for this, where you got this information, when you got this information, what you did with it afterwards. And you can start to build a chain of custody that will make that evidence stronger later on. You can, when you're talking to the unfortunate members of your communities who are victims of persecution, you can remember to note down a couple of key elements, not only what happened to them, but also who it was. Who were their abusers? What were their names? What did the facility look like? Where were they? And these things can be incredibly important down the road for criminal justice, and they need not get in the way of your other efforts. It's also the case that we need to be careful, right? And we've all heard the incredibly well-meaning but unfortunate stories of someone attempting to document the crimes of one of their community members who was a victim of some type of assault, but because they weren't well trained and they weren't experts in managing re-traumatization, they ended up putting those unfortunate victims in a worse place by trying to extract evidence from them when they possibly weren't the most well trained to do so. But that's a detail that once one knows about it can be solved quite simply by understanding who else might one send a victim witness to, who can assist them first and foremost and with social cycle needs, and then potentially identify what they might contribute to justice later on. But I think that the reason that I mention this to you as a group and have this great opportunity to talk to such a diverse group is because we will see, I think, time and time again in the future the fact that you have, in some jurisdictions, very committed domestic authorities who would like to bring cases against perpetrators of violence against religious minorities, and international justice mechanisms who also seek to do that. But they are not always on the ground, right? The often noted comparison in the places that I've had the opportunity to work is that what is often called the field by international investigators and domestic prosecutors is just called home by a lot of you in the field. And it is important that when we are trying to do justice globally, that those that have the opportunity to work in the international space don't forget that all of these places are home to a massive number of advocates. And the power and the strength that you have as advocates, not only with your voice, but also your ability to collect and document evidence and provide that verifiable proof of criminality. It's just simply another powerful tool in the toolbox that we all have to promote religious freedom. And I think that if we can do that together, we can continue to demonstrate that persecution will not stand. We can demonstrate that more individuals will be brought to justice, because there is a simple equation. The more evidence we have of criminality, and the more evidence we can use against those who are most responsible for crimes against religious minorities and others, the more cases we will have, the more opportunities we will have for criminal justice. And not only that, I think as we work with our partner governments, like the United States, like the Europeans that spoke yesterday, as we work with them as civil society, it is of course our job to continue to remind them to put pressure on irresponsible governments and governments that are committing crimes against religious minorities. But it is also, I would suggest, our responsibility as civil society to assist them in that regard. And one of the ways that we can make the work of our colleagues in the United States government that much better, more effective, is to provide them with additional evidence of this criminality, with additional demonstration of the fact that these people are responsible for these crimes. And the more evidence they have, the stronger voice they have in the international community to put pressure on those who would choose to infringe upon the rights of our colleagues across the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the work that CEJA does. Our next and final speaker is Naomi Kikoler, who is the acting director of, and I know I'm going to butcher it, the Simon Scott. Did I? Scott. Good. See, I always get it messed up. Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. She's leading the center's policy engagement and documenting crimes of genocide committed by ISIS and others. And we have had a long collaboration with Naomi in the center and the Holocaust Museum as well. And we have former GCJ staff working there now with her. So it's a real delight to have Naomi here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelley, and it's a real honor to be here. I just want to recognize what Nima said at the very end about how incredibly difficult it is to be here and have to share your experience. And we're sorry that you have to do that, because in a way that shows how far we still have to go. The fact that we have to head this panel shows that unfortunately we continue to fail to heed the lessons of the Holocaust and past genocides. And I'll comment a little bit on that, but I do want to just acknowledge it's a real honor to be here on a panel with such an incredibly dynamic, innovative group of people who seek to do and not just talk. So I really commend the Department of State for hosting the ministerial and for convening this conversation. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is a living memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. When our institution was created, it was envisioned to ensure that the institution would speak to the present and the future as much as preserve the history of the past. Our mandate, essentially, and the mandate of the center, the Simon Scott Center, is to do for communities today what was not done for Jews during the Holocaust. On Monday, we hosted over 40 survivors of modern-day religious persecution. One of the guides that took the survivors through is Irene Weiss. There is a photo in the museum, which is the last image where Irene is separated from her mother in Auschwitz. We're talking about documentation today from the perspective of its utility for accountability in a broad sense, because as Kelley mentioned, memorialization is one critical component. A recognition of the dignity of those who have been killed or suffered is equally important. The advancement of formal justice is yet again another critical pillar that all comes from documentation. I walk through the museum and I look for the faces of my family members there. 4 years ago, when we went to northern Iraq to do the first documentation of the crimes committed against the Yazidi, the Christians, the Shia Shabak, and others, we did that with the pursuit of ensuring that people could not say in the future that it did not happen, that people could not simply ignore the reality that communities had lived in Nineveh, and that ideally one day we would see formal justice in a fair and impartial way undertaken both at the local level and also internationally, ideally. As an institution, we focus on essentially a number of different pillars, and I want to just highlight something because for us the Holocaust serves as a warning of what happens when you do not heed the early warning signs of the destructions for societies and the political and economic ramifications that are felt long beyond the immediate communities that were affected. For us, the fact that we have to have this conversation essentially violates, unfortunately, the memory of the past. One of the components that is critical to acknowledge today, and that for which documentation is actually really important because it helps us understand what were the warning signs, what were the elements of the crimes that were committed. We can look at today and work backwards to help governments, help local organizations and communities look for those particular warning signs because we know that genocide is not spontaneous. And we also know that if you detect the human rights violations, you detect the changes in behaviors on the ground, we can take early preventive action that will save lives. But what does that require? It requires that we unpack and learn the lessons, identify the warning signs. It requires that we ensure that there are people, including foreign government officials, who are trained and who are working in hard-to-reach areas with vulnerable communities and are reporting back the warning signs that they see of impending risks against communities, that they are looking specifically at risks that target religious communities, ethnic minorities, and others, and are elevating that within their own governments to ensure that there is some form of preventive action taken. It requires that we also have the ability to work and understand complicated situations. We unfortunately in December made an announcement that we had felt that there was compelling evidence that the Burmese military committed genocide against the Rohingya. They have also committed crimes against humanity against broader communities. That information, the unfortunate situation whereby for over a decade there had been warning signs that genocide would occur and that those warning signs went in many cases, again, unheeded, is also the product of the fact that we sometimes find it challenging to prioritize atrocity prevention alongside other strategic interests and national interest goals that we are advancing. We must be able to balance both the pursuit of advancing democratic reforms or economic interests alongside the prevention of mass atrocity crimes. One cannot say you've had a success in a particular country when you have genocide committed alongside those successes. And we have to recognize that for Burma, for Iraq, and for many of the countries that we are concerned about today. The center and our work also focus on trying to put a light on what is all too often invisible. If you go to our website, you'll see we have a system, it's the Early Warning Project, that looks at risks of mass killing targeting communities. It looks at all 193 countries to determine risks. We also go to places like Iraq to put a spotlight on the crimes that occurred and document the crimes that took place. But we are drawing on some challenging circumstances, and that is just pivoting to the current, and I won't say current because I think this has been an endemic challenge around political will, which both Karim and Chris and Kelley mentioned. We face a reality where we have a divided Security Council and have for had a long time. We also face considerable goodwill in terms of rhetoric, invocation of norms by many governments, including governments that champion human rights. But when it actually comes to translating that into on-the-ground preventive action or assistance that will help local communities, we all too often fall short. And we saw that again in cases like Burma or even in Iraq when we did our report on the Commission of Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity against minority communities. We made a point of explaining and outlining very clearly that since 2003, there was an abundance of information that, if properly discerned, could have prompted a more concerted discussion of the options for early prevention and response. 2003, Karim and Chris worked on a situation that unfolded over a decade later. So we have to continue to push our political leaders who are here to match the rhetoric with political reality. And just very briefly, in the accountability space, If we don't do that today, we run the risk of finding ourselves in the same situation where we're debating today about the merits of UN peacekeeping, how to reform US peacekeeping, because we risk heightening expectations without actually matching the expectations for local communities with the actual economic resources needed to advance and support work like Karim's, with the political support that's needed to ensure that people have access to areas in countries where many governments don't want them to go. We have an effort to secure political solutions so that we can actually see fair and impartial trials held at a local level. And that requires real concerted efforts by governments to, on a day-in, day-out basis for the long term, invest in advancing accountability and preventing atrocities. Until then, we continue to rest on the shoulders of survivors like Nima and others. We at the Holocaust Museum, I would encourage you to go, and if you have any questions, I can answer them, but also put you in touch with our colleague Anna Cave, who runs the Forensic International Justice Initiative, who is working with local communities and with survivor groups to try to learn the lessons of how they have sought accountability, how we can share those lessons, how we can build the coalitions that are needed to mobilize political will and advance cases, and ensure that we actually are doing documentation for a myriad of reasons, as was mentioned before, one of which is actual formal prosecutions and hopefully deterrence. Finally, just to close, we also have to become comfortable with calling the crimes for what they are. When we see genocide happen, the crime of all crimes, when we see large-scale crimes against humanity happen, we cannot shy away from using the terms. For once the crimes have already happened, we are doing what little we can because we have already failed to act to prevent those crimes. It is almost the least thing that we can do to stand in solidarity and try to pave an opening for these communities to receive the justice and assistance that they need, but also to send a signal to governments that such behavior cannot continue. We can't allow impunity to prevail. So when you see it, you need to say it, and you need to ensure that action is taken in response. And just finally, as I close, perhaps a cautionary tale. I think all of us have said that we can't undertake documentation purely for documentation's sake, that we seek goals and outcomes with them. I think it's also important to help local communities understand that building cases for formal justice processes is very difficult, is time-intensive, and it may not result in an actual verdict or finding that genocide or crimes against humanity occurred. Because that is not the legal outcome of a case does not mean that the crimes did not take place. It is a recognition of just how difficult the work that Chris and Karim is undertaking, the challenges of trying to prosecute often decades after when crimes occurred, and we need to work with local communities so that they understand the processes and they can have some agency and involvement themselves. We also have a responsibility to not fetishize the nature of the crimes that took place, to recognize that in Iraq, genocide was committed against communities in a number of different ways. It is not just the women who bear that experience and the stories, and we need to ensure that everyone's voice is heard, and to push to ensure that we see at the local level reforms undertaken, the provision of security for vulnerable communities who still live in countries and areas where these crimes have taken place, for the Rohingya today who are in northern Rakhine and who face ongoing threats, for the Yazidis and the Christians who are trying to go home, or for those who have been able to return and require security. And finally, to ensure that those who do have the courage to come forward and testify, those who have the courage to be whistleblowers and speak out, receive the assistance from the international community that their courage requires so that we can actually advance the course of justice and hopefully in doing so tackle impunity. So I would just like to again thank everyone for being here and for the conveners putting an emphasis on this issue, and I'd like to hope that in future years we don't have to be back here discussing these issues, and Nima does not have to continue to speak on behalf of her community. Thank you.
Wow, what a great panel. I'm so, again, so honored to be here with these incredible practitioners and advocates. And I just want to thank you again for those challenges that you've really put out for us. I take them very much to heart. And in fact, I wish that all the participants in the ministerial could have heard this panel, because I think it is such an important one to help break down those silos that Chris talked about, and how we often put these issues in silos here at the State Department. It's a constant struggle to break down those silos, and in the international community as a whole, it's a real struggle as well. So I really, I think this has been a very rich discussion, and I do wish that all of my colleagues could have heard it today. And I especially take the conversation about political will to heart. It's something that it is. It's, as a policymaker, it's the constant struggle for us. And I will carry that back with me in my daily work as well. But I know we have just a few minutes. I'm looking at Rory, who's keeping me on schedule. And so I'm going to just ask one question that I think your presentations all kind of raised for me. And I think when we talk about how we break down those silos, I wanted to ask if you, in your work, see any particular challenges around documentation of the violations and abuses of human rights committed on religious grounds or against members of religious and ethnic minority groups. And I'm especially thinking, you know, as Naomi talks about the need not to fetishize these things, and again, that's a really, I think, critical point, because while I think there's this tension between what she says about the need to call things by their right name, but then also the need not to fetishize those things, and not to say that there's some hierarchy of abuses or hierarchy of victims. I think that these are really challenging issues for all of us, but when you talk about doing this work with religious communities, I especially think about the challenges around documenting and getting the information around sexual violence in religious communities, and how the particular dynamics of that are complicated. And so I'd just love to hear from all three of you about that. And then if Rory will let me, I'll take a couple questions from the audience. But if you could go ahead and just fire away. Anybody? Anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just very quickly touch on a couple of examples and just anecdotes. You know, in the work that we were doing in northern Iraq, and as Chris and Karim will know, some of these communities are incredibly tiny. The Sabian Mandaean community, there's essentially 12 families that had to flee Nineveh. So the challenges of even finding these communities, the trust building that is required to have them actually speak because they've been repeatedly targeted, and the fear that comes from speaking out that their family members will be then targeted, or that it will make it difficult. I mean, these communities yearn often for acceptance within a broader society, and rising your head above and speaking out about the atrocities that you have been the victims of often can be perceived by some in the mainstream as putting you outside of the realm of what is acceptable. On sexual violence, there are, as many of you know, immense taboos. And that's why I think, as Chris was alluding to at the end, it is so incredibly critical that those who undertake the documentation efforts, but also journalists who are telling the stories, policymakers that are going to visit camps, heed just the basic best practices. You know, I walked into a camp, and this is not the first time this has happened. Someone came up to me and said, "Don't you want to speak to my sister? She's the rape survivor that everyone's been interviewing." We have a duty of care to those that we work alongside with, but you have to, as Chris said, recognize that you work alongside with and for. So those are some of the kind of smaller challenges. And then just to speak to your point, and I'm using the Iraq example, you know, 10% of Iraq's population are religious and ethnic minorities. And it is incredibly difficult to walk into meetings with policymakers around the world and have them say, but the focus needs to be on Sunni Shia, don't distract with a focus on religious minorities. How do you preserve a diverse, pluralistic society founded on human rights when you are willing to cast aside 10% of your population or a population? So to a degree, we have to recognize that it is essential and appropriate for the well-being and stability of many of the countries that we work with or come from that we talk about this issue. It is not a political endeavor. It is an issue that has to have priority because of the unique vulnerabilities that particular groups face.
Thank you. Karim, Chris, do you have anything to add?
Sure. Yeah, I think that one of the challenges that we face across these different environments, these different spaces, is as we're talking about documentation here today, documenting the responsibility of those who are behind the scenes. It is the unfortunate reality that those people who are usually caught on video, or the people that the victim communities can name, are the people who implement some type of policy of religious oppression, but they are not the masterminds. It is often the case that those who are developing the policies, who are calling the shots, have removed themselves physically from the criminality and have been able to hide behind that lack of evidence. And often that is where the biggest challenges to find impunity lie. In every situation that's different, because in every situation those orders or those commands take a different form. In some places those are faxes and couriers of hard copies of paper. In other places it's messages on phones. In other places it's emails. And it's really a challenge to get that type of evidence. And when it is possible, it is incredibly important to have, because as we're talking about documentation, it's that type of evidence that is not only incredibly powerful for bringing these people to justice, but once you have evidence that's strong enough for criminal justice purposes, you also have evidence that's strong enough for sanctions. And when you talk about these people at higher levels who are responsible for these policies of religious persecution, then they often are interested in traveling to New York and go shopping, or to Berlin. And when you have evidence that can demonstrate that these people are human rights violators, then they no longer get visas to Europe and North America, right? They no longer get to hold their bank accounts in London, and they're no longer able to benefit from the exploitation that they're engaged in at home. And so any of this evidence that we can put together, as hard as it is to come by, to demonstrate the culpability of those at high levels, I think is incredibly important for furthering this cause. Thank you.
Well, I agree with the comments from Chris, and Naomi made many really quite profound points, which I fully endorse. What I would say is, arising from something Naomi said, and she gives the example of Iraq and the report that plotted and charted some of the genesis, some of the warning signs back to 2003. I think it's important to understand that in societies where there are atrocity crimes, there's been a number of failings over a period of time, and therefore a lot of baggage exists. And so before the investigators come in, there has been a complete degradation very often of trust with the different groups. And so building trust is really a precursor before people will speak to you about, even that they're a member of a minority, or that they, what are their beliefs, never mind what happened to them. And what we've seen time and time again, and not just Iraq, but really in all theaters I've been involved in, is, despite we being in the 21st century, we see stigma still being placed upon the victims. Iraq is an example. So how do we deal with that? Because you can't get the account when there's a punishment again, somehow there's a pain that is inflicted upon the individual that is a hero by surviving. And it's there that religious leaders have a very important role. I think it's not only countering extremism, promoting tolerance is the flip side of that. You can't just counter extremism in a vacuum. You counter extremism, and on the other side is promoting tolerance. And I think there has to be a fight for moderation. What we've done in Iraq is that I made a concerted effort to go and speak to the Grand Ayatollah of the Shia community. He immediately spoke about, before he mentioned Shias, he spoke about protecting Christians and Yazidis. I went to Cardinal Sacco, the Chalajian Church in Iraq. And again, he expressed these important principles, the head of the Council of Sunnis, and of course Babu Sheikh. Now, these leaders, for me, have a very important role, because it's not just religion, it's not just culture, there's tribal baggage, there's this idea of honor that needs to be dragged into the 21st century in many ways. And one truth is there, the legal system cannot penetrate every single home in relation to every single family that has felt pain. But what religious leaders can do, and together we can do, is create an environment in which if there is a lady, for the sake of argument, who has been raped and her child is born innocent according to all religions, and the father, the family are dealing with that very bitter reality, which is not easy, that the grandchild is also a product of a rape, to realize that woman, and later on that child, as he or she grows up, can say, look, according to this religious leader or that religious leader, we're innocent, so please give us a break. I mean, I think that is actually as important sometimes as going into the courtroom and creating a record that stands the test of time. And it's there that religious leaders, congregations, have that responsibility to provide this safety net of sanctuary and support for those people that have already lived through things that nobody should be expected to have to endure.
Thank you. Thank you. Those were great answers. So I am going to take one quick round of questions. There are microphones if you can get to them, or are we walking? Are they? Yes. So sorry. If you can get to a microphone, they're on either side of the room. And I will start with this gentleman because he's ready to go. Please identify yourself.
Good morning. My name is Homi Gandhi, and I represent Zoroastrian faith. The minority of the minorities, or the minorities' faith. It is one of the first monotheistic faith, and the population of that has decreased considerably. I don't know what you mean by genocide. One Zoroastrian killed anywhere in the world tantamounts to hundreds of thousands of Christians or Islamists. That is the number. I'm very grateful for you indicating how do we approach, and I would like to know more about it. There are Kurd Zoroastrians today which are facing the same difficulties as Iranians or Tutsis felt in the 7th and 8th century in Persia. They went as refugees to India and some other parts of the world. So I would like to know what you mean by genocide. 2, 3? I mean, for Zoroastrians, it will be a calamity if 2 and 3 are killed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to collect like 3 or 4 questions. Let's go ahead on this side. He's over here.
My name is Dea Arwejde. I'm a Syrian lawyer. I lead the Syrian Initiative to Combat Sexual and Gender-Based Violence at American University Washington College of Law. We have seen in Syria utilization of sexual violence to repress certain religious groups, whether we consider them minorities from like their size or proportionate size in the society, or as general faith groups in Syria. The government also turned the political or the religious groups into political opponent in a way that monopolizing their political opinion and actually retaliating from those who demonstrate different opinions. So to that end, I want to hear more from CIJA about the specific procedures that they take into consideration when they document sexual violence, regarding also sexual violence happening in the government and in their paramilitary custody. I want to just understand whether you guys discuss the narratives around the crimes and the violations. The second question also about the
I'm
international.
sorry, we have such little time.
Just quickly, one. International national law. We know as lawyers that international law is the court of last resort, or it's the last resort. What do you do as CIJA and other groups to make sure that the data that you collect is permissible and admissible by a court of law that might be established later in Syria? Thank you.
Okay, and I'm just going to take one more, and then we're going to.
Thank you. My name is Ani Zoneveld, Muslims for Progressive Values. So you talk about the post-conflict and the genocide and the investigative processes. However, what I'm seeing, what's happening in India, the fanatical Hindus on Muslims and other religious minorities, these are benchmarks and characteristics of the trajectory of the intolerance in that society. As a Malaysian, Malaysia is my country of birth, and I see the intolerance as a Muslim towards non-Muslims and the religious minorities. I see that being ramped up in partnership between the government or the previous government with religious authorities. Karim, you talked about religious authorities having a positive role, but what can we do and what can you do in your capacity in order to push back against the religious intolerance that's being used by politicians in ramping up this conflict?
Okay, so those are some great questions. I'm just going to let you guys take, whoever wants to go first, and take whatever you can.
Well, with your leave, I'll take the first question in relation to genocide. It's not a maths test. It's not a mathematical formula. Both the Quran and the Talmud say in different terms that to kill one individual is as if to kill all of humanity. Genocide is an intent crime, so it's the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. So if that intent is made out by the evidence, even one person doesn't need to be killed. It can be incitement to commit genocide as one of the early warning mechanisms that could also be used, because we see very often before the actual killing there's a restriction on freedoms. There's the equivalent of having to wear the yellow star, being denied certain access, being denied access to universities. So that's the answer in relation to that. In relation to the second question, I think that's Sija. And the third question, very briefly, I think what we do is exactly what you're doing today. None of us should be passive, should be sedentary. We're not spectators. We have duties as congregations as well as members of the clergy where religions have a clergy, politicians, statesmen, those that give funding, to realize that religious tolerance is not some kind of, as I said, it's not only an individual issue of the heart, of the soul. It actually leads to population movements, refugee movements, a lack of investments, and of course, ultimately, massive crimes. And the conversations that need to take place on this issue is that this isn't a soft issue. It is a fundamental issue to stability and to progress. And if decision makers in donor countries, along with congregations, insist on a new enlightenment everywhere, which is driven by the watchword of compassion and tolerance and inclusivity, not upon division and hatred, I think we'll be halfway there.
Naomi, Chris, anything to add on any of those questions?
Sure. I think the two-part question on documenting sexual violence and related to admissibility, I can answer as one relatively quickly for now. Those are two incredibly complex things to deal with in this forum, but they're all easily broken down into small pieces. Documentation for authenticity. So if you recovered a piece of paper from a government building and you needed to document how you got it, where you got it, why you got it, then you just need a formula to do that. And the opposite side of the exciting TV investigations shows that we see quite often is the reality of chain of custody documentation, which is very simple, and it just means doing the same thing every time. And if you have a formula and you fill out the paperwork the same way every time, as boring as it is, then you are very far down the road of proper documentation. When it comes to sexual violence and dealing with victims of sexual violence, it's an incredibly serious issue and would take a lot more time, of course, to discuss in full. But I can tell you that Siege's approach is that none of our team members would engage in an interview with someone who is a victim of sexual violence until after they'd had about 1.5 years of training on that. And it is my humble opinion that everybody else should should adhere to a similar policy. And there are a great number of individuals out there who spend a lot of time working on issues related to the traumatization of victims of sexual violence, and they are the first people to turn to, not the interviewer for criminal justice purposes in that space. It is important that the well-being of those members of our communities who are the unfortunate victims of these crimes be first and foremost. And of course, even though I work in the justice space, it is always secondary to the well-being of victims. Thank you.
Naomi, do you have anything to add? Just very quickly, just wanted to say that on kind of early warning signs, the UN's Office of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide has a number of tools and resources that are useful for local communities to better understand. And I would encourage you to look at those, and also the work of the special rapporteurs, the special procedures, who could be helpful in specific cases. And then just appreciated the point that was made just around the effort at times by governments who are intent on committing crimes to create divisions within communities. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to really try to get a better and more localized and nuanced understanding of the dynamics of conflicts and how perpetrators intentionally do that. So thank you.
Thank you. And I wish that we had more time, because I know there are a lot of questions, but I believe most of our panelists are going to be around for a little while, so I'm going to give you permission to just buttonhole them outside. But we do have to turn the room over for the next panel. And I just want to give them another round of applause for doing such an amazing job. This rock star panel, so awesome. And thank you all for being such a great audience. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the ministerial. Yes.
Before we break to the breakout sessions, I got a couple of words of instruction. Just first, as someone who is listening to these 4 excellent presentations, I think I can speak for everyone. We're so thankful for all your commitment to this issue and your work in this field, and the many, many people you're helping bring wholeness back to from just finding out what happened to their loved ones. So thank you for all of your years of service. A few words of information and instruction. First, I want to give a shout out to my colleagues in the Office of International Religious Freedom, our Office of Protocol, Diplomatic Security, for the tremendous work they've been doing over weeks and weeks and weeks and days and long nights and no weekends for a while to make this a reality. I think it's really fitting that this week here in America we're commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing. So when Neil Armstrong stepped out on the surface of the moon, that was the big moment, like we're having today. But there were, hundreds and hundreds of people that helped make that moment possible, and my colleagues have been doing that, so I hope you'd give them a round of applause. And I will say that tomorrow night's closing reception at the African American Holocaust Museum, they're going to project on the Washington Monument, I don't know how, but they're going to make it look like a Saturn V rocket, the whole thing.
They've been doing it since yesterday.
Oh, they started yesterday, so it's out there now. And I think that's such a fitting way for us to end tomorrow. Just as someone who's been in this field a long time, I really feel like over the past 2 years, the work we put into this for the first ministerial, now this one, is really sort of our moonshot. How do we meet the challenge of persecution that seems to be increasing everywhere? How do we come together across this great diversity, religious, all faiths and none, different politics, different regions, around the issue of freedom of belief, conscience for everyone. So I'm so thankful you're here. Now, the information I have to share. We'll have a short 15-minute break, and we have 3 breakout sessions that you're welcome to go to. You can pick whichever one you want. Well, this is the biggest event ever held at the State Department, and we think the biggest religious freedom event ever in history.